Welcome to Up on the Bars discussion with your host, Roy Bain.
Well, I'm Roy Bain. We're recording a Thursday edition of Up on the Bars discussion. I'm very excited to talk to the person that you see sitting on here with me. NASCAR driver, NASCAR pioneer, a completely different story of your normal NASCAR driver. We have Mr. Bill Lester joining us. And Bill, thank you for taking the time. I know you got a busy, hectic schedule. You're a very, very busy guy. You're a motivational speaker, and I can't wait to hear your story. This is going to be awesome.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Roy. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Well, when I talked to him on the other day, I talked to you on the phone the other day. I said I normally do it in my truck, and I had to explain it's not as hillbilly as it sounds. I promise. We try to be very professional on here. So it's kind of funny how I ended up getting Bill on the show. Ed Renzi posted up a story about your book and trying to help you sell your book, which we're going to plug right now. It's called Winning in Reverse. It's the story of Bill Lester and what he did and how he accomplished his goals with racing. So if you get a chance, get the book. I've listened to the forward. Great listening. I can't wait to see the rest of the book. But Jeff Finley, another NASCAR driver, commented on there, and I said, man, I've been trying to get hold of him to come on the show and all that stuff. And then Bill answers back, you found me. It's like, that's how this all. So it happened real quick. So thank you for responding to that, and thank you for agreeing to take the time. I appreciate it.
No, it's good to be here. It's amazing how something positive out of social media has come about. So I'm happy for that.
I try to be very positive, never negative. Try not to delve into that pond. We try to use it for the right way to promote our sport. You love racing. I love racing. We got awesome stuff to talk about. So now I have to ask you the title of your book, Winning in Reverse. I haven't got into the meats and potatoes of the book, but is it a play on how your career progressed in NASCAR, or does it have a different meaning for you and why you said that? Because you don't come from the traditional background of racing. So what does the name Winning in Reverse represent to you with your book?
Well, you kind of hit the nail on the head when you talked about it initially, about my career, how I was able to live my life, live my dream, reach my goals, but I did it fairly atypically from most race car drivers. As you're probably well aware, most race car drivers start at a very young age, typically single digit, with go-karts or, sprint cars or I should say not sprint cars, quarter midgets, whatever the case is. And they work their way up through the ranks. And, eventually by the time they're in their teens, maybe even their early 20s, whatever, they're a professional race car driver. For me, I didn't get that opportunity at a very young age. My father fortunately exposed me to racing at a young age. He took me to a race when I was growing up in Northern California. But it was a Can-Am race. It was a professional Can-Am race at Laguna Seca in Monterey. And that kind of, set the hook. I got bit by the bug then because I loved what I saw, because my father knew that I liked, sports cars and race cars. And, my parents would tell me I never went anywhere without a Matchbox or Hot Wheels in my hand. But when he took me to the race, man, that was it. I wanted to be a race car driver, but my parents did not have the, financial wherewithal or the knowledge, or inclination to put me behind the wheel of a race car. They were like, well, if you want to be a race car driver, good luck. Get yourself hopefully a job or a career that can afford you to get behind the wheel of a race car. And that's kind of really what my story is that I spent a long time finally becoming a professional race car driver full time at the age of 40. At the age when most race car drivers were winding down their career, that's when I became a professional. But, there's a whole lot of years in between. We can talk about, my educational background and how that was my springboard to getting me behind the wheel of a race car, to becoming, a NASCAR Cup Series rookie at 45 years of age, so I know everything that Jimmy Johnson went through to become an IndyCar rookie at 45. It's no easy task. But, the story behind my book title is that I lived my dream. I basically was able to do with what I wanted to do in my life, but I did it in reverse. I did it the way a typical race car driver does it. I got there, didn't take no for an answer, but I took it through basically the road less traveled, right? The hardest way to go about it. That's kind of how I did it, So I'm happy I made it. I'm proud that I made it. And, I just basically wrote this book as a motivational memoir. It's not as a autobiography or anything like that. I basically identified 8 keys to my being successful. And I wanted to share those with people so that, no matter what your walk of life is, not necessarily race car driving, but whatever it is you want to do, if you take these 8 keys, these components, and apply them, I believe you can be successful just like I was.
Right. And so we were talking about it, and I read the background on your family. Your dad was very educated, had an engineering degree, then went back and got his doctorate degree, if I read that correctly.
Let me correct you. He got a PhD in theoretical chemistry.
Okay.
I'm the engineer. He's a theoretical chemist.
Oh, good Lord, that's even worse. Those are the classes I did not do very well in school in, so it's like, oh my goodness. So your parents basically encouraged you to have a love of motorsports, but said, hey, we can't do this for you. It's up to you to do it. So they encouraged you to get an education. You got your Bachelor of Science in electrical engineering and computer science. Then you did what the typical person does. You went and got a job working in that field. You went to work with Hewlett Packard. You were at a time when Silicon Valley was probably the most booming industry in the United States. That time when you were working at Hewlett Packard, that was when all the computer rush was on, all that. I want to know how that was working in that time frame, because we see stories in movies and stuff like that. And here you are, hey, I've got this, I'm working in it, but I have another passion. So what were your thought process while you were doing all that?
Well, the reason I chose engineering is because, as I was indicating, my father was working for IBM in the Silicon Valley down in San Jose. And he was using computers to help predict the collisions between atoms and molecules, right? He was doing something called quantum Monte Carlo. And so he would take me when I was younger on the weekends to the research facility. And I would see all these computers in the basement, with the lights blinking and the tape drive spinning and the disk drive spinning and whirring. And I was like, this is pretty cool stuff, right? And I was always mechanically inclined as a kid, So I was thinking, what, engineering might be my, means to an end, right? It was my tool to get me to where I wanted to go. And so that's what took me into engineering. It wasn't any real love for engineering. It was a means to an end, right? I wanted to be a race car driver. And as we talked about, my parents were not going to be, in any position to pony up and help me do that. So I had to find a career that would get me a reasonable income in the shortest period of time, right? Because, your typical occupations at that time where you could gain, a lot of income were, doctor, lawyer, dentist, that sort of thing. And that took a lot of, postdoc type of education. I wanted to get my rear end kicked, which is what I did for 4 years and come out of there with a reasonable salary. And that's why I went to HP. That's why I went through engineering. And essentially with that first paycheck, I bought my first race car.
Yeah. And so your first race car, so I read something there. You started out, you were Rookie of the Year in 1985 for the SEC at NorCal. This is where I'm going to compare and contrast. You went to UC Berkeley. You lived in California. If there ever was the real Cole Trickle story, this is you. You were not a NASCAR. You just went over to the East Coast and said, hey, I want to do this. You come from the other side of it. You went over there, and this was a whole. You're the Cole Trickle. I'm sorry, I don't care what anybody says. So I didn't read your story. So what got you started in the road course racing? Because that's kind of a different. We most everybody watching this is circle track. We don't know a lot about the road courses. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit how you got into road course racing and what was you apparently had instant success. It seems like.
Yeah, a lot of that, again, was exposure from my father. He liked, European exotic cars, Ferraris and, Porsches and Lamborghinis, that sort of thing back then were the top cars. I mean, they don't have like, Koenigseggs then like they do now, and some of these super, high exotic cars. But Lamborghinis and Ferraris and Porsches were kind of like, the sexy European cars. And those are cars that kind of turned me on as well. I mean, I like the muscle cars. Don't get me wrong. I mean, one of my favorite cars back then was a '69 Chevelle. The Cudas, I love those as well. The Mustangs, they were all really cool. But I wasn't a stoplight guy. I wasn't a quarter mile guy. I was the type of guy who really liked just the road racing aspect of driving. In other words, sliding cars around corners and stuff like that, in full drifts. I was doing the Fast and the Furious type of stuff before it was a movie, right? I was doing all kinds of crazy antics on the street, but it wasn't quarter mile stuff. It was mostly, car control stuff where it was just trying to be on the edge of adhesion. I enjoyed that sort of stuff when I started getting behind the wheel. And I thought that my career is going to take me to like the Indy 500 or the 24 hours of Daytona or 24 hours of Le Mans. I never thought that I would come to the Southeast and race in NASCAR because I wasn't exposed to it, right? I was exposed to more of the European type of road racing and sports car racing that was out there in California. There was quarter mile drag racing stuff in Southern California, but I'm a Northern California guy. And, a lot of the stuff that I saw there was just like really a lot of Indy 500 stuff, Indy and open wheel action, Formula One. That's the kind of stuff that I watched on TV. So for me to come to the Southeast is nothing that I had planned for myself.
It was like, it just kind of an afterthought. So we're going to get to it. So I was reading your car that you won. You picked up the 86 regional road race champion. It says you were driving a Camaro at that time. So you were driving the muscle car during that time. How did it go to a Camaro? Was that your first car, or how did you end up racing a Camaro? That's my first question.
Well, in actuality, when I went through Sports Car Club of America road racing school and went through the championship series, I was racing a Mazda. Okay, so I was racing a rotary engine car, right? Yeah, so it wasn't a piston popper; it was a rotary. So, no, I mean, most of my early racing was based on rotary engines and Mazda power. And the way I wound up getting into a Camaro was because after I won Northern California Road Racing Rookie of the Year and the championship, I said, listen, I don't want to be an amateur. I want to be a pro. So my first foray into professional racing was the IMSA racing series in 1989. IMSA is the International Motorsports Association. And I got behind the wheel of a Trans Am / IMSA spec Camaro. So we're talking about 650, 700 horsepower Chevy Camaro with a straight cut gearbox instead of a synchro mesh gearbox, which is what I was used to with the Mazda, and going from about 250, 280 horsepower to, like I said, about 650 to 700. So it was a huge step, for me as far as a race car driver. And I got to race with guys that were not racing for checkered flags per se. They were racing for money, right? So there's a whole different mindset and attitude. And I wanted to see if I could hang with those guys, right? So that's what I did. I jumped into the deep end and was able to effectively swim and not sink. And I was then able to answer for myself, this is really what I want to do. I want to keep on climbing the ladder. And I thought that with very little time, I would wind up being a full-time professional. But no, that wasn't the case. I did my first pro race in '89, and I didn't do my next professional race really in sports cars until like the 24 hours of Daytona in 1998. So there were a whole lot of years at working in the Silicon Valley and, paying my dues there and being successful by everybody else's definition but my own, because I define success as happiness, and I really wasn't that happy. I had a ability to do the tech work, but I didn't have a love for it. I wanted to be racing. So, I got married, and my wife said, listen, you're not getting any younger, any easier to live with. Go out and make the dream of yours become a reality, or say that you gave it your best shot and it wasn't meant to be. So fortunately, I was able to make it happen and, start out with this Camaro and then wound up road racing sports cars in the 24 hours of Daytona, and then getting the opportunity to test in NASCAR. And that's kind of where Ed Renzi comes into play.
Right. And then we're going to transition. So I have to ask you, with the road course racing, being in Oakland, you're less than 100 miles from Sears Point. Did that influence your road course background? Did you go see some racing at Sears Point there, or is that kind of where the road course race came into? Because it was basically in your backyard in Oakland.
Yeah, both Laguna Seca and Monterey, Laguna Seca, where I saw my first race, my dad brought me to when I was just shy of 8 years old, and Sears Point were basically in my backyard. They were both within, like you said, about 50 miles or so of where I was living. And so I watched a whole bunch of races, professional races, and these guys that were doing what I wanted to do at those two tracks. So, yeah, it was really access. And, I just enjoyed watching that type of racing, and it was exciting to me. So, road racing is kind of where I thought, like I said, I would wind up.
All right. So you went to the 24 hours at Daytona. I have to ask, because to me, in my mindset, I drive for a living, and I know you have breaks, you share drivers. How hard is that on you mentally and physically, doing a 24-hour race at Daytona? To me, like, that seems like that is a grueling, that has to have a big effect on your mind and all that stuff during that day. Can you walk us through how that works and how you set your mind up to do 24 hours of a race?
Sure, absolutely. Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that it's not as if you're the only driver behind the wheel for 24 hours. So
right.
It's a team event where you typically have 3 other, co-drivers, a team of 4, and you run in what are called stints, or blocks of time by which you're on the clock, you're racing, and then you have time off once you're done with your stint. So you might start the race, maybe at noon, and then you run till about 2 p.m. or so for 2 hours. And then the next guy, you bring the car in the pits, it gets tires, fuel adjustments, whatever. And then the next driver hops in and he goes for maybe 2 hours or so while you rest and recuperate, right? So it's really a very interesting scenario where you got to be on the chip, ready to take care of business for your stint. But then you got to basically unwind, relax, take in, food and hydrate and all that kind of stuff so that you're ready for when it's your next stint. So, if you start maybe at noon and go till 2, you may not be back on the clock again until maybe 8, 10 o'clock in the evening. So when you started out at high noon and the sun was up, you might be getting behind the wheel the next time and the sun is setting, or it might be dark, or whatever the case is. And then even your next stint after that, you could be tapped on the shoulder at 3 or 4 in the morning where it's pitch black, for your next stint, right? And so you're just hoping that the car continues to circulate and that, you're not running into any problems and none of your co-drivers made any errors, and that, you're trying to relax and recuperate and all that sort of thing. But it's really hard because you don't leave the track. You're at the track while the competition is continuing to run and circulate, but you're still trying to unwind and, relax and all that sort of thing. But then when it's time for you to get back behind the wheel, you jump in and take care of business. So it's a really interesting scenario because you got to be on it, and then you got to basically, shut down, and then you got to get back up and get on the wheel again. So it's a lot of fun because, for me, it's nothing like being on track at like 3 or so in the morning, and you're driving into a corner and you see the flames coming out of the tailpipes of the car in front of you. And as they turn into the corner, you see the brake disc glowing. And I mean, it's just a surreal experience. You don't see anybody in the stands because they're dark, and you got to basically know the track because it's lit, but it's not like really well lit. And so you kind of got to know exactly where your braking points are and when you need to get back on the button and, all that kind of stuff. And there's a lot of give and take with regard to the other competition out there because, you're trying to make sure you see the checkered flag the next day. As they say, the adage goes, you can't win the race on the first lap, but you can sure lose it. So you're trying to make sure that you're there to see the checker flag once 24 hours is up.
Well, and you mentioned something with the other competitors. Okay, you may be in this type of car, then they have the other different types of cars on there. So you have some that either have bigger horsepower than you, less horsepower than you. Closing rates are different on all those different cars. Now you're talking about 3 other drivers. You say they come in, add fuel, make adjustments. The adjustments they make on the car may not be geared towards you. It may be geared to what the other driver ahead of you said or the driver after you says. So when you get back in, it's probably not the same car. So there's a lot of factors in that race and then not to mention, if you've been to Daytona, Florida, it is hot and it's humid. It is brutal. That, to me, that would just take such a toll in a 24-hour period to do that. It's amazing to see drivers do that. And I just wanted to get a perspective from somebody that's been there and done that, how grueling that is, because it's not an easy feat, whether anybody wants to say it or not. It's not easy to do.
No, it's difficult. And the fact of the matter is that we run the 24 towards the end of January or the beginning of February, depending on, what year we're talking about. And when I say that, I've run the Rolex 24 at Daytona for 10 years, right? I've done it 10 times, right? And while it's not that hot, what you definitely experience is rain. Sometimes when you start out, it's dry or it's or it's wet. And the next time you get behind the wheel, it's the opposite, so you could be on rain tires, right? Because with these sports cars, we run on rain tires, rain or shine, we run, right? Right. And so you could be on rain tires on one stint, and then when you're back again, you're on slicks, right? And so that changes all your braking points and, all the dynamics of the car in terms of how you, soften it up for rain. And, then you go back to your regular setting when it's dry and all that kind of stuff, because you're trying to soften it up for more grip, right? Because the track is slick. But no, there's all sorts of dynamics that come into play throughout a 24-hour race. And like you said, the drivers have different styles and techniques. So we might be changing brake bias and, that sort of thing, or sway bar adjustments and stuff like that in the cockpit, that sort of thing. We don't do a lot of adjustments really on pit road. We pretty much do more tires and fuel, but we definitely do adjustments behind the wheel, in the cockpit while we're on our stint. And then before we hand it off to the next driver, we typically zero it out or make it neutral again so that the next driver hops back in there and he can make whatever adjustments are necessary to suit him.
Okay. I didn't know about the adjustments inside the car. I know about brake bias. We have that, but the other stuff you're talking about, I didn't know that. See, I learned something about the Daytona 24 hours. I didn't know that. So, but it is very cool. So now we're going to roll into, you've done the Daytona races, the 24 hours. Then you rolled into testing. Tell us how that all came about. Because I have to say, Jeff Finley's comment the first time he met you was kind of funny on that Facebook post. So tell us how that all came about and then how it progressed from there.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, the fact is that in the early 90s, John Andretti, the late John Andretti, did something that those of us that watched open wheel racing, IndyCar racing, were mesmerized by. And what I mean by that is that he was very successful racing for Jim Hall in IndyCars. And then he left and went to NASCAR. And all of us in the open wheel ranks were like, why in the heck would he do that? Well, what John Andretti saw very early on was a progression towards NASCAR stock car racing as opposed to IndyCar racing. At one point, IndyCar racing seemed to, on a national perspective, not in the Southeast, but on a national perspective, IndyCar racing was the big draw, right? The Indy 500, nothing compared to that. Even though Daytona 500 is big and what have you, the Indy 500 is like the single greatest sporting day spectacle, I guess, in the country. And so he left Indy cars to go to NASCAR. We were like going, okay, that's peculiar. And then as I was progressing through my, sports car racing, I started seeing a whole lot more of the growth and proliferation of NASCAR. And so, as I did that Rolex 24 and everything, and that was great. I love sports car racing. I kept on seeing how NASCAR racing was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And as a professional race car driver, you want to race on the biggest stage that you can against the best of the best, right? And so I had the good fortune of meeting Ed Renzi, former president and CEO of McDonald's, at a celebrity charity event. And we got an opportunity to spend some time together. And after we were introduced, he said, listen, I heard that you are pretty successful in racing those little sporty cars. I'm like, yeah. And he said, well, have you ever raced a heavy car? And I said, well, what do you mean by a heavy car? He said, a stock car. And I said, no, I've never had that opportunity. And he goes, well, it's good talking to you. And, we kind of broke it off there. And lo and behold, not too much later, he called me up and he said, you know what? An opportunity has presented itself and I want to test you in a stock car. And I said, okay, great. And at that point I was thinking, okay, that's cool, because again, NASCAR was growing by leaps and bounds and it looked like a great opportunity. And so I thought Ed was going to bring me out to, a private test, all just, him and I in the car and all that kind of stuff. Well, he winds up bringing me to an ARCA race weekend at Anderson Speedway in Indiana, or Anderson Raceway in Indiana. And this is a full-on ARCA race weekend. The heavy hitters were there, Frank Kimmel, Ken Schrader, those guys were there. And so while Ed had a primary driver for his team, he then had the guys roll out a primer gray backup car. And he said, well, Bill, there's your car. Show me what you can do. I'm like, what do you mean? He goes, I want you to go out there and run this car out there on this track. And I looked at this track. It had it's a 1/4 mile high bank, figure 8 infield. I'd never seen anything like that in my life. I'd never seen a track that small. When I first saw it, I was like, what do you do at a place like this? You can't race cars here. It's not big enough, because you got to realize I'm used to three and a half, 4 mile length tracks, not a quarter mile high bank oval, right? So I have no experience in the land of circle track, right? So I was like, okay, fine. I'm a race car driver. Let me see what I can do. So I jumped behind the wheel of this backup car. And while he didn't enter me in the race itself, he had me out there while everybody was practicing for the race that evening, or maybe the next day. I can't remember. And had, the times that I practiced with been in qualifying, I would have had a top 10 start. And so Ed was suitably impressed. And he said, Bill, I don't know what I can do, but, stay tuned and we'll see what happens. And that led me to my first NASCAR start when he entered me in the, I guess it was the 100-mile race at the Glen, the Busch Grand National race in 1999, where I made my NASCAR, Busch Series debut.
That was the Lysol 200 or something. I think I read that at Watkins Glen, which this leads me back to a funny story to relate with you. I recruited for the Navy in Canandaigua, New York. One of our areas that we recruited at was Watkins Glen. The very first racetrack I went to was Canandaigua Land of Legends racetrack right there in Canandaigua. That's where I kind of got exposed to what we're doing way back when. So it's kind of neat you're talking about that. Watkins Glen is a beautiful place. It's, if you've ever been there in the summertime, it's a great place to go to.
Absolutely. Yeah. The Finger Lakes region, it's beautiful. And I mean, I love that track, and Ed thought that would be a great place for me to make my debut because it's a road course, and so I'm very familiar and comfortable on a road course. I wasn't really used to the NASCAR, environment. So it was a great transitional, scenario for me. And, it went really well in that race. And that led to an opportunity to be on the testing program with GM, and got that under my belt. And then the next thing you know, Dodge announces a diversity program, and I was able to throw my hat in there.
Yeah. Well, and I'm going to point out, at this point, when you started at the race at Watkins Glen, that you put you in a very elite category that nobody can ever take away from you. And we have to point this out. You were the first African-American driver to ever start a Busch race at that point. Not only that, it's your first time racing a stock car. That is, how cooler of a story could you ever get than something like that? That is a barrier-breaking moment for you in the sport. And this is where I want to lead to, because you talked about your atypical journey. Mm-hmm. You attended UC Berkeley, and I don't want to talk politics. We're not going down that road. But it is known for being a very liberal university, a very liberal area. You're a minority going to the Southeast is primarily ultra conservative to the other side. You didn't fit any mold, and you said, heck, I'm just going to jump in a car and go race. This is why I'm saying you are the cold trickle. You just said, hey, I'm just going to up and leave sports car. We're going to hop in these and we're going to go out there. And you made the race. That's, to me, you can't ask for a better script than what you accomplished at Watkins Glen.
Oh, I appreciate that, Roy. I mean, it was huge because, like you said, from a cultural perspective, it was completely different than anything that I was used to. From a car perspective, a stock car was completely different than anything I was used to. I mean, when you talk about, high elite sports cars, you're talking about, composite bodies and carbon fiber and, that kind of stuff. You're not talking about, tube frame chassis with, rolled steel bodies on them and stuff. And, you're talking about, sexy 6-speed transmissions, and you're not talking about a regular H pattern 4-speed, that sort of thing. So it was a completely different driving style. The mentality that the drivers have in NASCAR is totally different than those that road race stock sports cars. And what I mean by that is that, when you go to a stock car race, there's a backup. There's a primary car and a backup. When you go to a sports car race, there's one car. You're right. Because, we don't lean on each other like you do in NASCAR. There's a whole different mindset in terms of how you race each other in sports cars versus NASCAR. I mean, and I really had to sharpen that pencil when it came to NASCAR, because there was no, quarter given. There was no holds barred, that sort of thing. And, some of the guys are like, man, go lean on right back, that sort of thing. Because, in sports cars, you typically have to wind up spending time with, the race director, when you're involved in an incident, right? In NASCAR, it's like, nah, man, Rubbin's racing, you use it up, just if you win, just bring home the steering wheel, all those kind of adages, and so that was very different. The way that I communicated with folks in NASCAR was completely different than the way I communicated with people in, the road racing circles. Because, if you talk about a car that was loose, you say in sports cars, it's oversteering, right? Mm-hmm. If it's tight in NASCAR, then it's understeering in sports cars, right? So, I started talking about loose and tight and got to learn about terms like wedge and, stagger and all that kind of stuff, which you don't deal with in sports cars because you turn right and you turn left, right? So you don't set the car up just to go left. And so it was a whole different vocabulary, a whole different way of communicating. It was a way that I had to interact with my team members, my crew guys, because they're like, who is this guy coming from Northern California who doesn't look like us, doesn't talk like us? I can share a story where when I was with Bobby Hamilton Racing, I was out there during a lunch break when the guys were working on the truck, and one of the guys was talking about how he was having a problem with his Cub Cadet. And, they were talking about it, and I made the mistake of going, what's a Cub Cadet? And they all stopped the conversation and looked at me like I had two heads, because in California, we don't have acres of land. We have a postage stamp for grass, right? I mean, you can cut your grass with a push mower, right? There's no such thing as a gas mower. So I come to the Southeast, and these guys know what all these, riding mowers are and everything. I'd never seen a riding mower until I came to the Southeast to race in NASCAR. So they're like, where do you come from again? I'm like, Northern California. They, oh, that's like Baywatch, right? You live on the beach, right? I'm like, no, it's not like that. I live in a concrete canyon in the Silicon Valley. It's not like Baywatch. But that was the impression everybody in the Southeast had for Californians, is that we all lived on the beach, right? Because of Baywatch and its popularity. So trust me when I tell you, it was a huge, cultural melting pot when they learned a lot about me and, my background, and I learned a heck of a lot about them and their background.
And we have to go back and talk about, during the time frame that you're going out there, it still wasn't the most accepting crowd, whether anybody wants to admit it or not. This was in a time, it was a different time. That's when I went in the Navy, and I was having a conversation with somebody yesterday when we were talking to you today. I grew up on a small farm in New Mexico. We weren't exposed to a whole lot. I joined the Navy. I found out, there's a whole other world out there. And you learn that in boot camp. And it's like, wait, what I was taught growing up is not 100% accurate. So you start getting what everybody calls a worldview, and you see it as it's way different once you get out there. And so I can only imagine you going from out there to a series, and we're seeing some big changes in NASCAR right now, and you were kind of helping make all that happen. And I think and like I said, you were in an era where it was completely different. So I want to ask you, did you have any challenges that you had to face during that time personally?
Yeah, Roy. I mean, there's no doubt that I wasn't accepted by everybody. There's no question about that. I mean, I'd heard the N-word thrown around, people muttering under their breath. Nobody got in my face and called me one, fortunately, or there have been some issues. But, I was definitely kind of before my time, before the NASCAR Drive for Diversity and, all the things that surround, bringing more inclusivity into the sport. I was kind of out there on an island. And I remember one of the most intimidating times was when at Martinsville, only the Cup guys get to park their haulers inside the track. All the guys in the truck series and stuff are up on the hill and everything. And so at the time when, I would go to the hauler and, from the driver's lot, outside of the track to walk to the hauler, it was a very intimidating time. I had a lot of anxiety because people would stop and, wonder why I was there. I would get to the hauler, I would change into my fire suit, and then I would start walking back to the track, and people again would start staring. And it's like, who is this guy? Why is he wearing a fire suit? Right? He must be crew or something like that. But, again, they would never believe in 100 years that I was, about to go and compete and get behind the wheel. But, I'd heard some things said. I'd seen the actions. I'd seen the responses of me being there. It was difficult. It was not very welcoming by any stretch of the imagination. But I knew within myself that I was there to do a job, right? I was there, and I had as much right as anybody else had to be there. And so I did what I had to do to the best of my ability so I could, again, live my dream, climb this, this mountain and be a race car driver, professional race car driver. A lot of people relied and depended upon me, but nobody put more pressure on me to be successful than myself. I have very high standards, and even though I didn't come from a NASCAR or short track or circle track background, I tried to learn the most I could about the vehicles as fast as I could. But nothing takes away from having years and years of experience on a circle track, on dirt. I've never, even to this day in my life, been at a dirt track, let alone competed on dirt. I've never had that experience in my life. So when a lot of NASCAR drivers say, well, we all have that thing in common where we all raced on dirt, I'm like, I haven't. I don't know what that's like. And so I come from a totally different discipline, a totally different type of race car with totally different dynamics in terms of how you make them faster and everything. But if you have that communication between you and your crew chief, and your crew chief gives you what you ask for, then you can be successful. And that's how I was able to be as successful as I was throughout the years that I was able to compete, because, I wasn't fortunately a one and done. I competed in NASCAR for a number of years, from, my first race in 1999 through my last race in 2007, in NASCAR. So that's a pretty darn good career for a guy that doesn't come from money, and every year has to try to beat the pavement and work the phones and do everything alongside your team to make sure that you're behind the wheel of that race car, So, there were some bumps in the road, and, I'm sure some folks were like, why is this guy here? He's not one of us, but, I went out there, I dealt with the booze during driver introductions and stuff like that. That happened as well. Talladega was a very, very intense experience as well, because there's so many people there. And I'd heard about the infield jail and stuff like that, because, it's like they go there to party, and all of a sudden, oh, by the way, there's a race going on, that sort of thing, right? That's how it was back then. They showed up on Tuesday for a race that following Sunday, right? They don't show up now, a day in advance. It was a darn near a week-long procession. So, it was quite an eye-opener, but I'm glad that I had the experience. I'm glad that I was fortunate enough to live my dream and believe in myself, and not take no for an answer.
All right. So you were talking about all the tracks and getting around and going to the different stuff. That's kind of a segue into one of my sponsors. We got Get in the Stands. We're going to play his commercial. That's Scott Kozak and his team. They have a directory of all the racetracks in America. You can click on it, enter where you're at. You can check out any of the races that are in the area, any of the racetracks that are in the area. So we're going to run his commercial real quick. We'll be right back.
For race fans across the United States, GetInTheStands.com is the place to find racetracks where you live and where you're traveling. Just go to GetInTheStands.com and enter your location. You'll see the tracks within 100 miles of that point, either as a list or on a map. GetInTheStands.com is 100% free to use and mobile friendly. So whether you're on a computer, a tablet, or on your phone, there's no need to download an app. To find racetracks across the United States, open your web browser and head to GetInTheStands.com. GetInTheStands.com, your racetrack directory.
All right. So I'm going to extend an invite. If you're out here on the West Coast visiting and you want to go to a dirt track, call me. We're at a dirt track every weekend. We'll meet you somewhere. We'll take you out and show you the dirt tracks. We'll show you what it's all about.
No, that's cool. I mean, I'm in Atlanta now, so I don't get that much of an opportunity, but I'll definitely take you up on it if I have it.
That's what I said. If you get out this side, we got several that we do filming. You'll get to see it from our perspective. So you're talking about jumping in the deep end. We started all this podcast. I jumped in the deep end. I didn't have a clue what we were going to start. I went and bought a used mixing board and a microphone in the cab of my truck. The first subject we talked about was Porta-John etiquette in the pits at a racetrack on a weekend, because, my wife goes and she doesn't like it. It's like, come on, have some class in the pits and, kind of that kind of thing. So, and it's morphed into something that's way different, way cool, and getting an opportunity to talk to people like you is way, way cool. So you talked about the drive for diversity happening a little while after you left the sport. Do you think you influenced that program to come about? Because I, from an outsider looking in, I think you probably influenced that and started changing hearts and minds, whether you knew it or not.
Yeah, there's no question that I was, a factor with regard to the Drive for Diversity program. And I can tell you that unequivocally, because before the Drive for Diversity program was announced, NASCAR had a diversity council where industry executives and those from, the racing side of things would get together and talk about, how can we make the sport, more open to everybody and more inviting to everybody. And, there's been some prominent people on that council, like, Brad Doherty, who's still a NASCAR team owner. Let's see who else was on there. I'm trying to think, just industry executives and stuff. And so, yeah, we would identify things and they would look, at me a lot of the times in terms of, hey, what can we do? How can we make it, more inclusive? How can we make it more inviting? That sort of thing. And so one of the things I talked about is that, if we could get assistance in trying to gain the financial footing to make it feasible, that would go a long way. And that kind of, I think, led towards the Drive for Diversity program, because there are a lot of drivers of color out there that want to be a part of it, but just don't have the financial wherewithal. I mean, it's plain and simple. It takes a lot of money. And I don't care what color you are or what gender you are. I mean, money doesn't discriminate. You got to pay with greenbacks. And, it's hard to get them unless you come from that sort of background. If you're on the outside looking in, it's an almost impossible, task to accomplish. And so many drivers are discouraged because they get to a point, and they're like, how do I get to that next, level where I can become a professional? And, even more by and large now than it was before, a driver comes first almost with his checkbook and then his helmet second. I mean, it's just ridiculous how the dynamics of the sport are. Before, way back when, it was like, talent and grit and determination. And the checkbook was, secondary, because it wasn't the cubic dollars that you need today. Now, I mean, if you look at just about all these kids that are coming up through the ranks, I mean, they all come from, wealth and privilege. I mean, I call them, trust fund kids, because there's a bunch of money there. It may not be their immediate family, but they know somebody who's the CEO of this company or the chief marketing officer of that company. And, they get that lug up. It's very difficult to just come with pure talent and get there, because you got to get through so many divisions and you got to climb so many steps before you're actually, given the opportunity to get to the professional level. So it's a very, very difficult sport to become involved in. It's not like a stick and ball sport where there's a lot of structure to it, and which level, which directions to take. Here, you can come from just about any discipline and get involved if you got the financial wherewithal to do so.
So I have to ask you, did you have the opportunity to meet Jesse Iwuji?
Oh yeah, I met Jesse. I
had him on the show. He impressed me because, number one, he brought Emmitt Smith for the time with what they were doing. I don't know the backstory of why it dissolved. Not worried about that. But I like their initiative to bring motorsports to inner cities, things like that. And you're talking about all this. This is they were working to do exactly what you were talking about, getting people of color involved in the sport from a younger age. And I think that was a really cool initiative they started. I'm going to avoid one subject for the most part, but we got Bubba Wallace. I remember cheering him on at Eldora. Coolest victory ever when he won the dirt in Eldora in the truck. I'm just going to say that right now. It was very cool to watch at that time. News came out in the last couple of days. I read a story. Rajah Caruth, it looks like he's moving to Junior Motorsports sometime in the near future into Xfinity Series. I didn't know who Rajah Caruth was until I watched the Family Business or whatever the show is on there, and they did it kind of an interview during that TV show and found out who he is. Very talented, very quiet, very under the radar driver, but he's super talented. Had a great successful year in 24, and looking forward to seeing what he does in 25. You're seeing the fruits of what you starting into this process, and that it's so cool to watch all of this stuff happening in like I said, it's winning hearts and minds, and I think that Rajah Caruth's got a very bright future ahead of him.
Yeah, no, I agree. I met him a couple of years back, and he was really trying hard to win and overdriving and having first lap accidents and a lot of things that he could have just avoided. And when I met him, I kind of took him aside and I said, "Man, listen, I've been watching you. You have a talent. You'll make it. Just let it come. Don't push so hard. Don't force it." Right. And he's really found his groove, and he's doing really well. Mr. Hendrick has brought him into his fold, and I think that has a lot to do with why he might be getting an opportunity with Junior Motorsports, because, needless to say, he and Junior are kind of tied at the hip. So there's a lot of, synergy there. But yeah, I think that he will go far in the sport, and I'm excited to see what he's doing. And, you know, there are a number of kids behind Raja that are in the Drive for Diversity program that hopefully will get the opportunity to continue to progress up the ladder. You know, it's all a matter of opportunity. I mean, it's, you know, people ask me, why aren't there more drivers of color in the sport? And I say it's two things. One is exposure, and two is opportunity. When I say exposure, it's the ability to be exposed to it at a young age. You know, like my father did. He exposed me to a race when I was just shy of 8, taking me to Laguna Seca for the Can-Am race, right? So that set the hook. So that's the exposure. And then I got the opportunity, like Ed Renzi gave me. He gave me that opportunity to be the first, you know, black driver to race in the Busch Grand National Series in '99. So with exposure and opportunity comes more people becoming involved and excited about it and that sort of thing. So that's why NASCAR has all these programs in place to try to broaden the net and make it, you know, bring more exposure to the sport to a broader audience. And so I commend them for that. You know, they got a long way to go, but they're sticking more than just their toe in the water. They didn't stick, you know, they didn't jump in with both feet, but at least they got one foot in. So they're going in the right direction.
Exactly. So we'll shift gears and go into the truck series. You raced several years full time in the truck series, started out with Bobby Hamilton, switched to Bill Davis. Tell us how that came about. And I saw some really flattering stuff from Kyle Busch and Brad Kosowski and doing research about you. So I want to ask you about what they had to say about you as a driver as we go into that. I lost you for some reason.
Yeah, sure. No, I got an opportunity to. You got it now? Oh.
Yeah, something's happening here. Hang on just a second. Let me take you out and bring you right back in. All right. Can I hear you now?
Okay.
All right.
I hope so. Do you hear me?
I can hear you now. We're good.
Okay. All right. So, you know, essentially what took place is that when I got my opportunity to race in the Busch Grand National race, it basically opened a number of eyes to my becoming involved in NASCAR more wholeheartedly. And, you know, Ed pretty much pushed every button that he could and got me involved in a development program with GM. But at the same time, Dodge was announcing a diversity program whereby they were going to sponsor a truck for 3 years in the hopes that it would bring more of corporate America who talked about diversity into the fold. Well, in those 3 years, basically nobody else got on the field with Dodge, and Dodge pulled the plug. But the first year, to determine who was going to get that opportunity to drive that truck, Bobby Hamilton conducted what I call a gong show, basically an audition with some of the top drivers of color to show up at Atlanta Motor Speedway and test a BHR truck to see who would get the opportunity to run for this program that Dodge was sponsoring. And so a number of drivers came out there. One of them was Willie T. Ribbs, who at this point was the biggest name, you know, black name in racing. He'd been at the Indy 500. He'd done SCCA Trans Am and IMSA road racing stuff and was very successful. And so Dodge thought that Willie T. Ribbs would be the one who would show the best during this testing. Well, as it turned out after the testing, Bobby Hamilton came over to me and said, "Hey, Bill, tell me what your salary requirements are." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He goes, "Well, you're my pick to run this truck next year." And I said, "Cool." I was thinking my ship had come in. I'm about to become a full-time professional race car driver. Well, he called me up a couple of weeks later and said, "Bill, I got some bad news." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Well, you know, Dodge, with this big program, this big splash they're making, they wanted to have the biggest name. They thought Willie T. Ribbs would be your selection and not Bill Lester, not you." Right. And so since they were the sponsor, they got to determine that Willie T. would get the first year in the Dodge program. And so Willie T. ran the number 8 Dodge truck in 2001. It didn't go as well as I think they anticipated, that being Dodge. And Bobby, during that year, said, "Hey, Bill, why don't you stay close to me? I want to see if I can give you a couple races on the side because I think that your opportunity is going to present itself again." I said, "Okay." So we did about 4 or so races alongside Willie T. And, you know, we were entered by another team, 31W insulation sponsored Wayne Day truck that was really a Bobby Hamilton racing truck. And when they did the gong show again at the end of 2001, that's when I got the nod to be the full-time driver of the number 8 truck for 2002 and 2003. So I raced for Dodge as a factory driver. My truck had the big Ram on it, looked just like Bill Elliott's Cup car. I mean, I was like in heaven. I was a full-time, factory race car driver. However, like I said, Dodge pulled the plug because nobody else came to the plate. No other corporations stepped up like Dodge gave them the opportunity to do. And so they pulled the plug, and I was fortunate enough through networking with people to meet a guy who was the president of Toyota. And there were rumblings about how Toyota wanted to get involved in NASCAR. So I got a chance to meet him. I said, listen, I understand that you guys are thinking about getting into NASCAR, first with the truck series. I raced with Dodge in the truck series. Is there an opportunity there possibly for me? And he said, I don't make those calls. I'm president of Toyota USA, but I'll put you in touch with the guy who's running, the racing program. And next thing you know, Lee White, who was the head then, was talking to Bill Davis. And I get a call from the general manager of Bill Davis Racing saying, hey, we want to test you because we're about to put out a program. And that led to my racing with Bill Davis for the next couple of years.
So racing for Bill Davis led for your first Cup start. I believe it was in your hometown of Atlanta right there. So in reading the comments from Kyle Busch and Brad Keselowski, they said you were one of the best qualifiers in the sport. And they talked about it. They said, I don't know if he just didn't understand that, whatever, or he just made it stick going into the corners. But they said you would go into the corners just flat matting it and just hope for the best. And I know you responded with saying, hey, it stuck, it just got lucky kind of thing. So tell us how, because we talked about road course racing. Getting off the corner was more important in NASCAR. Breaking into the corner was more important in the sport cars. And you were having to learn the two. How did you become known as, through those guys, as one of the best qualifiers in the sport? So walk us through your mindset with qualifying that made you so successful in the trucks.
Well, you know what? I wanted to be a race car driver because I always just loved going fast. The competition was great. I loved competition. But for me, the faster, the better. People always ask me, it's like, what are your favorite tracks? And I would always say the fastest ones, right? I'm not a short track driver. The intermediates I was very successful at. But, the fastest ones like Talladega and Daytona were the ones that I liked the best, even though I didn't have the most success at them. But I loved being in the draft. And I guess what the sports car racing basically endeared me to is just being extremely fast, right? When you come up on a short track background, as far as I can tell, you're never going all that fast. You might get to over 100 miles an hour, once or twice or whatever, between the corners. But, we were known for being over 100 miles an hour on a continual basis on road circuits, right? And
right.
So for me, I was very comfortable. I was in my element when I was going fast. And Atlanta Motor Speedway, it was one of the fastest tracks on the circuit. And it was my home track. And I just like AMS because of just the raw speed. And so for me, I didn't mat it flat around AMS in the Cup car, but I barely lifted and was right back into the power as soon as I turned into the corner. It was a brief lift and then smack right back dab on it. Whereas I heard the technique that most Cup drivers were using there was that they were driving deep into the corner, then getting out of it, and then getting back on the gas again. I didn't do that. I basically got out of it. I made that commitment to get out of the gas early and then matted it from the, before the center off. And so that worked out really well for me. But yeah, I could get around there in a couple of laps, but I could just not get the car that I wanted for a whole race run. It was difficult for me, and that's primarily because I didn't have a lot of experience behind the wheel of a Cup car, right? I didn't get that many opportunities. And the extra horsepower you have and the aerodynamics of a car versus the truck were day and night. With the truck, it slows itself down as soon as you get out of the gas. Whereas in the Cup car, with the aerodynamics of it shaped like a bullet, you got to use the brake, right? Yeah. So I just was never able to set up the Cup car like I wanted to. But yeah, as Brad, will tell you, and as Kyle will tell you, I was not afraid to go fast.
Right. And then you had 2 Cup starts. You had Atlanta and Michigan. You tried for a third. You spun during qualifying at California, so you didn't make it there because you had to, at that time, you had to race your way in. And back then they had a lot of excessive cars and you had to beat a lot of them. It's not so much these days, but it took a lot to get into a Cup race. So another stat that I saw that was very interesting, your rookie year in the trucks, you finished second to Brendan Gaughan. if I remember right, Brendan Gaughan had a Cinderella season in his rookie year. The dude was instantly successful. You were instantly successful. That's a huge accomplishment to finish second and all that stuff. One of the things you were known for is 2 consecutive poles in the Truck Series, some other things. But I want to ask you about your stats. It says you got 146 National Series starts for NASCAR. That puts you, I believe, third on the all-time list for African-American drivers in the sport. Another barrier moment for you. Do you have any regrets backing up on it? I know one of them you said is you didn't start earlier in your life and what could have been, but looking at it from an out now, do you feel like you accomplished what you wanted to in NASCAR at this moment? Because you didn't start till you were 45. You just told us at 45 years old when you basically got started.
Well, I mean, I started as a pro at 40 in the trucks, but I was a Cup rookie at 45. So, I mean, I started way late, but I got there. That's why I was saying winning in reverse. I won. I got there, but it just took me so long. And, yeah, I would have loved to have had the opportunity to start earlier. I can only imagine what could have been, what kind of driver I could have been had I started early at a single digit age, in karts and worked my way, up through the ranks. But that didn't happen. The only thing that I guess I really have regrets about is not making the show at California because I tried too hard, right? I really buried it into the corner in turn 3 during my qualifier. And I saw the tracker for, the lap tracker in terms of whether or not you would make the field or not. I was way under the tracker. I mean, I'd have made it easily if I like half throttled it. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but I'm saying I was really going for everything and the car didn't hold. And it wasn't the car that I had tested with because I damaged that car and we basically were going there with a backup car. So it wasn't set up quite the same. And I tried to carry the car. So I have regrets about the fact that I tried as hard as I didn't make the show. And the other regret I have is when I didn't make the show at Charlotte in the Truck Series. It was a home race for Bill Davis. And again, I just tried too hard and spun the truck out and didn't make the show. So those are the only 2 real regrets that I have. They were both during qualifying. Again, they say I was known as a qualifier. And those are 2 times where I didn't qualify. And those are probably the only 2 times I think in my career where I didn't qualify for a NASCAR race. And it's because, it's not as if I didn't leave anything on the table. I just tried too hard and tried to get more than what the car and the truck had. So that was probably pretty much it. I mean, had I had the chance to do it over, those are the only things I probably would have done over. But I think I took advantage of every opportunity that was presented to me. I think I carried myself with, grace and integrity throughout my whole racing career. I don't think really anybody has anything ill to say about me. I treated people with dignity and respect, and I carried myself to a high level and, never, backed out of that. So I think that I made an impression on the sport and I opened doors to some of those like we talked about that have followed me through it. And, I'm proud of myself. I mean, at the end of the day, I believe that I was given a God's given gift. And that was one of, being a race car driver, having car control, because one of the things we never talked about, I was never formally trained. I never went to a racing school. I didn't, in sports cars, it would have been Skip Barber or Jim Russell or Bob Bondurant. I never went to any of those racing schools, and I was good in sports cars, learning through the school of hard knocks, just given a gift of, seat of the pants feel of, what the edge of traction and adhesion was without typically overstepping it. And, in stock cars, as we talked about, I never grew up on a circle track. I'd never been at a dirt track, never raced on dirt and all that sort of stuff. And I'm racing against guys that's all they've done throughout their whole career, so I basically beat the odds. I basically did things that I was not supposed to achieve.
So, and it's funny you talk about the contrast to how you did it and the other people did it. My guest last week was a 12-year-old driver that won his Dwarf Car Nationals Sportsman Division Championship this past year and is going to start racing micros this next year. So exactly what you're talking about. I just talked to this young man last week and got to know him and his family really well. So it's kind of cool to hear both sides of the story. So we're right up on an hour. I'm going to ask you one last thing. and I'm going to turn the table on you just a little bit. What is the one question that you've always wanted to have somebody in media ask you, or one that you didn't want to ask and then get your response to it? Because I know somewhere in there's got to be one that you always wanted to be asked or didn't want to get asked.
Well, the question that I didn't want to get asked, that I was asked continuously, is what is it like to be a black driver in NASCAR? I got that so many times, it would make my skin crawl. And I'm like, look, I mean, I'm black, right? So what is it like to be a black driver in NASCAR? Well, I mean, I don't even know how to really answer that, right? So I found that somewhat irritating and just a poor question. You didn't do your research, whatever the case is. So I would say that unequivocally is the question that I would just fear a journalist would ask me. And lo and behold, I was asked that so many times, it drove me nuts.
But and I've seen that a lot, and I watched. That's why I kind of waited till later to get into it. But it's one of those things. But NPR, they called you immediately to ask you, and that's one of the stories I read this morning, and that seems to be I just like it, the fact that you went in there, you did it, and you didn't care what anybody else thought, and that's kind of me. I started this. I didn't even know how to turn on a computer when we started this. I just jumped in and started talking because I like talking racing and talking to people that have achieved success like you have, and it's awesome. And I just love to talk about racing. Doesn't matter what it is.
I appreciate that. And one of the things that's interesting is that I coined a phrase that Bubba used since I did it. I would answer sometimes a question whereby I would say, I don't want this to be about race. I want it to be about racing. And I would say that I'm a NASCAR driver who happens to be black, not a black race car driver.
And I agree with that. And that's what I said. And in being in the military, we were taught that, who cares? If we go into a main space fire on a ship, it doesn't matter the skin color, who's in there fighting the fire with you or holding your OBA tending line. You put your trust in that person. It doesn't matter. None of that matters. And unfortunately, it's not the way it is for people that are outside of the military. But when you're in there, it makes no difference about any of that stuff. And we just got to try to get away from it. But you achieved a monumental thing at starting at 40 years old. You achieved your dreams. So now I know you're doing motivational speaking. We talked a little bit about your books, all the keys. One of the keys I can tell that's in your book right now is to always leave everything you've got on the table, no matter what you do. I can almost assure you that, because everything you talked about is 100% all the time. That's what you said. You spun your car at qualifying or whatever because you were trying too hard. You were giving too much. Would that be a safe assumption? I haven't even read the book, so I'm just assuming that's one of them.
Yeah, the number one key that I identify is passion. You got to have passion for what it is you're doing, or you'll never get there, because you'll get discouraged. You'll be frustrated. You won't follow through. But for me, racing throughout my whole life, since a little kid, was the last thing I thought about before I went to bed, and the first thing I thought about when I got up in the morning. It was what drove me, So without passion, I don't believe anybody will meet their ultimate success, because it won't allow you to drive yourself above and beyond. And for me, I mean, there was nothing else that anybody could sway or deter me, toward, other than if it had to do with racing, because that was it. It was in my blood. What I thought about. It was how I was built. It's, what goes through my veins. It's me. Right. And so thankfully, I'm at a point in my life where that's no longer the case. I could actually step back from racing. I can enjoy watching racing. I don't have the itch and the bug anymore. I got it out of my system. But I mean, I am so fortunate and blessed to have been able to live my dream, because I don't know what my existence would have been like had I not achieved that success. I can say that wholeheartedly, that that really makes me satisfied that I was able to do that, because I believe that that was the gift that I was given. Everybody's given certain gifts. It's up to that individual to identify them. And once they do, to live them, live through them, live them out, live out your dreams.
Yep. And that is a perfect ending point. I'm going to stop the recording right here. And I appreciate all your time. And I hope everybody that listens to this enjoys it. And we're out for Thursday.